Perfect. And I think the attendees are slowing down, so most people that are here are in. So we'll get started for our 2022 webinar series for August. I'm Lane Mosier with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. Thanks for tuning in this morning. We are joined today by Alexis Grinde, who is a wildlife ecologist with the Natural Resources Research Institute out of Duluth, and she's going to be talking about some early successional bird species. Alexis, you can just take it away.
Great. How does that look, Lane? Thank you.
Looks great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you to the 24 people that are in attendance live. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and hear about the bird species of Minnesota. Like Lane said, I am Alexis Grinde and I run the Avian Ecology Lab at the Natural Resources Research Institute. And we have been doing a lot of different studies on all sorts of different forest birds. But I'm going to talk to you today about two sort of different but related studies and really the preliminary results of both of those studies. And hopefully they'll be more formalized in the very near future, but hopefully to give you just a broad overview of our research and some of the outcomes of our research. And also make you fall in love with birds if you aren't already. The people that have done most of the data collection for this is my master's student, Brett Howland, and one of the field techs that work in my lab, Stephen Nelson. They spend a tremendous amount of their lives in Minnesota's forests, in the very thick, dense, wet, buggy forests of Minnesota in May, June, and July. And it is incredibly hard work. And so I just want to first and foremost thank them for all of the data that they've collected and their passion for birds, because without them, of course, I wouldn't have anything to talk about. So I'll go ahead and get started. So as you all probably know, we are in a global crisis when we're talking about the loss of biodiversity. It's happening everywhere, and of course North America and the Great Lakes region in Minnesota is no exception to that biodiversity loss. And we're losing biodiversity for a variety of reasons, and it's sort of dependent on where in the globe you are, but big things like climate change, land use conversion, all of that have contributed to the declines in biodiversity. In 2019, there was this big study that came out in Science, and it relayed data from the breeding bird surveys that have been collected since the 1970s to document bird trends across North America. And that study found that North America has lost over 3 billion birds since the 1970s, or roughly 1 in 4 birds. So that's a lot of birds. That's a lot of biomass. That's a lot of individuals, animals that do a lot of things for our ecosystem, right? And so we focus on just forest bird populations. They've declined by 1.2 billion birds. And again, this is a big deal because birds, like all species in the world, play a really critical role in the environment, in the ecosystem services they provide. So specifically for forest birds, there's been studies to show that birds eat up to 98% of spruce budworms, and over 40% of non-outbreak insects. And some people have valued this at about $5,000 per year per square mile of forest. So that could translate, this loss of birds really could translate into literally billions and billions of dollars and declines in forest health across the landscape. And so it's a big deal, right? And so we really want to think about what can we do about it, what can we do about it, and what should we do about it? Well, we again know from a lot of different studies that while there are a lot of contributing factors for the loss of biodiversity, habitat loss and degradation is one of the major threats. And that's pretty much true across taxa, and it's also very true for birds. This is really important for Minnesota and across the Great Lakes region because we have one of the most diverse breeding bird communities in all of North America. Over 200 species breed in Minnesota's forests relatively consistently. And so if we're talking about, well, these bird populations are declining and they breed in Minnesota and it's in Minnesota's forests, well, we can use Minnesota's forest management as a tool to really create high quality habitats and ultimately help conserve forest birds in the long run. We in my lab use birds as an environmental indicator. So they're really sensitive to changes in landscape composition and also small scale habitat changes. So all bird species sort of have like this place in the forest where they like to hang out, or specific habitat features that they're responding to. And so if we can sort of say, okay, well, look, all of these species that are cavity nesters are increasing. Oh, okay, that's great. And there's a lot of older trees on the landscape in this particular area. That's great. That's probably why there's a lot of cavity nesters. Or vice versa, if early successional species are declining and there's been a decline in forest management, we can say, okay, well, that's something we can do, right? We can create more early successional forest. There's options for land management. So basically what we do is sort of use these long-term population trends that we get from a lot of different areas, including the breeding bird surveys that are conducted by volunteers across very large landscapes. But we also run a long-term, I think it's 27-year breeding bird monitoring program in Chippewa and Superior National Forest. And it provides a lot of information for us to sort of focus in on what species specifically in Minnesota's forests are increasing, decreasing, or do we need to get more information about. But ultimately, these bird population trends provide a lot of really important information that we can use to help guide landscape level planning, and then also stand level management practices, or develop best management practices for that sort of crosswalk between forest management and then also provide features for these breeding birds. So that was sort of the idea when we started this first study that I'm going to talk to you about today. And the first study was funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund as recommended by the Legislative Citizen Commission of Minnesota Resources. And so this study actually just ended July 1st. And so we're still kind of compiling a lot of the data, but it focused on three focal species. And we picked these three species because they had documented significant population declines across their breeding range, but really specifically, they had a lot of declines out east in the eastern part of their range, as you can see on these like red maps. And because of those documented population declines, they have been rated by either federal, state, or local agencies as species of conservation concern. So all three of these species are species in greatest conservation need as designated by the Minnesota DNR. And those species are the golden wing warbler. I'm going to play you the song. Maybe you've heard it before. We say it sounds like bee buzz, buzz, buzz. So it's a male golden wing warbler. And the second part of the talk, I'll focus on these guys quite a bit. The second species is a veery, which is a type of thrush, or it's related to like robins. And they have that really flute-like song. It's beautiful. Hopefully you guys are hearing this. And then lastly, the American woodcock. And what you're going to hear on this one is this peent, sort of this like sort of zing noise. And it's not a songbird, he's a shorebird, and so he's just not as vocal or has as pretty of a song as the other two. But these three species all use different types of early successional forest, but they are very dependent on early successional forests. And so we wanted to figure out what are the common sort of habitat features that they're responding to, and are there sort of landscape and stand level management practices that we could put together when we're thinking about, okay, we're managing for young forests. So one of the big things that sort of changed about bird ecology in the past, I don't know, 15 or so years, is that the technologies have changed and we've been able to study birds beyond just when they're singing. And that's led to a really big increase in how we look at effective conservation efforts. And so we know now that conservation efforts are most effective when we include not just the nesting habitat, but also the habitat that the birds use after they leave the nest. And so this is sort of the breeding life cycle is what we call it, where we have the adults, the males and females will migrate back to Minnesota, choose a nesting area, lay eggs, Those eggs will be hatchlings, and it depends on the bird species, how long they'll be hatchlings, but anywhere from a week to 2 weeks. And then those hatchlings will finally get their feathers and turn into what we call fledglings, and that's when the birds actually are able to leave the nest and fly around and sort of move around the forest. And so we call this whole life cycle the nesting to post-fledgling time period. And we really wanted to understand the differences in the needs of those 3 focal species during this nesting to post-fledgling time period. And really importantly, we wanted to figure out when or where do most of the mortalities occur, and are there habitat features that prevent fledglings from turning into adults, or to try and mitigate any sort of that mortality that might happen. Okay, so the study goals for this first study are were to understand the associations between landscape, habitat features, and overall productivity, nest success, nestling success, and then fledgling success. We also used radio transmitters to help us document the habitat use and survival of these juvenile birds. And then again, we're using a lot of that information to try and tie it back to forest management practices. So our study area for this was near or just sort of north of Warba by Grand Rapids on UPM Blandin land. And the study occurred 2019 and 2020. And we chose that area because we had been doing long-term monitoring there, sort of looking at the changes in territorial males singing or using point counts to see how bird communities have changed over in response to forest management. The study area is really like largely aspen dominated. There's a big matrix of different age classes, and so anywhere from just very recently cut to up to 50 years old when it was getting ready to cut again. Again, it's aspen dominated, but there are a lot of pockets of northern hardwood areas, of course, lowland conifer, and yeah, it's northern Minnesota, so a lot of shrub swamp sort of situated amongst the maple, or excuse me, amongst the aspen as well. So our study area was approximately 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, and in that area, we were looking for nests of all of our focal species. So what we did is we conducted systematic nest searches. And so basically these transects up and down and up and down this focal area. And we used my favorite part actually of the study is that I got to have a dog as a field technician. Her name is Riley, and she's trained by Debbie Peterson, and especially trained to do woodcock nest finding, and then also like just very, very specially trained, and I'll show you a video of it in a second. But we use it to find nests of American woodcock, and then we just use regular old human field technicians for all the other focal species. Once we found the nests, we would monitor them to see if the nest actually succeeded, if it was predated, if a storm came and wiped it out. And then we would document things like how many eggs were there, how many of those eggs survived into the nestling stage, and how many nestlings survived to the fledgling stage. And that sort of stuff provides great information about overall productivity. So here's a video of Riley taken by Debbie Peterson. We do the American woodcock nest searching in early I should say late April to early May through June, depending on the weather. It's been quite variable. But you can see Riley's on point here. And you can also just notice, because it'll come up later, that there's not a lot of vegetation out at this point when the nestling is coming. There, the mom just flushed off. And so then Debbie notices, where did that mom come from? And Riley's looking disappointed. And then Debbie can go and hopefully be very careful to not step on any eggs or baby birds. And notice how incredibly camouflaged this young American woodcock chick is. Isn't that crazy? It's really cool. It's really amazing that we even find any, let alone as many as we did. And Debbie and Riley were awesome field technicians for this study. At that point, then we would take the fledgling, the woodcock in that case, and attach transmitters The other two focal species, of course, nest in just nests in trees, and so they're a little bit easier to monitor. We would track the birds using radio telemetry, get the habitat use locations, and then we did vegetation surveys and insect surveys to really quantify the different types of habitats and features they seemed to be responding to. So here's just some pictures of the three focal species. The golden wing warbler, you can see the nests, they're sort of peeking out, and then when they're old enough, we band them, and then they have to be a certain size. Then we attach the transmitter on the back, sort of using a backpack loop harness. Veeries are quite a bit bigger than golden wing warblers when they're in the nest. They grow faster, they're bigger birds in general. And so they look kind of more adultish when we're able to put the transmitter on. And then there again, you can see the American woodcock, and you kind of have to squint almost to see there's a nestling in that top picture. But the woodcock juveniles wear more of a necklace harness attachment for their transmitters. So one of the things that we wanted to understand is, when do they die? And the ones that survive, what habitat features might be associated with them surviving? So for golden wing warblers, veery, and woodcock, we basically analyzed the data the same way. And what you're looking at on these graphs is, on the y-axis is percent mortality. And so when do we see the majority of mortality occur? The green lines across the top are that 80% threshold that seemed to be a good sort of baseline for saying, okay, well, when do 80% of the mortalities occur for each of these birds? And with that, then we can see sort of this area where the dashed red line and the dashed green line intersect. Well, that's the area or the time period that we're saying that they're very highly vulnerable, or they're most likely to die. The juvenile golden wing warblers are most vulnerable 0 to 7 days post-fledgling. And I'll talk about, so after they leave the nest, and I'll talk about golden wings more in detail in just a second. But really during that time, they depend on dense shrub cover. And then after they get past day 7 or day 8, they can start moving into the higher parts of the canopy, and they become much better flyers and less likely to get predated. Veeries, they only have a 0 to 4 day post-fledgling high vulnerability period. They had overall I think it was 84% survival compared to golden wing warblers, which are like less than 50%. And so veery are just I think because they're bigger and they can move more quickly right out of the nest, they can get to places where they're not as likely to be predated. But again, during that highly vulnerable time, they were really dependent on dense shrub for cover, and then they can start moving to the canopy, and they use a lot of the like sort of mid-story and understory throughout their whole juvenile time period. So woodcock juveniles, they nest on the ground, and so they just start walking right away right after they hatch, and they don't fly for quite some time. So they're basically like little mice running around on the ground, and they have a highly vulnerable time period of 0 to 12 days. And the thing with the woodcock is that they were really susceptible to weather, and especially those extreme weather events like a big rainstorm, or we had like an ice storm one year. And you know, the poor little buddies just died because the vegetation wasn't out like you saw in the video, and there wasn't a lot of places to hide. The ones that did survive were in areas with a lot of coarse woody debris, or a lot of just areas like down logs, down trees, with a pretty dense understory where they could hide from the elements, but also there was quite a few predations as well. And so that just gave them more areas to just sort of take cover and blend in a little bit more. So that was really important for the woodcock. Interestingly, our study showed that the females were not nesting in early successional areas like have been documented in a lot of different studies. It was definitely like a 30-year-old aspen stand, and there was a lot of group not group, but there's like small gaps, and they were going to those small gaps where there's more structure, where we're sort of seeing some regeneration. And there was an area of the plot with a lot of down trees that the woodcocks from different broods, even if they were nesting from each other, all kind of ended up going there. So this idea of messy forestry seems to be really important for American woodcock, especially during that highly vulnerable time period. This is a Veery. She's going to be fed by a parent here. So cute. So overall, this portion of the study are 3 focal species. The common theme is that dense understory with these dense shrub layers were really important during that high vulnerability. Juveniles didn't really care about cover type as they aged, but they were really responding to a lot of different structure in the canopy. That's different than a lot of species. Like, for example, we also study boreal chickadees. Those guys blast right up to the top of the canopy in these black spruce stands, and they don't care so much about the structure, but all these early successional species are really using these different horizontal and vertical structures as well. So ultimately, the mosaic of stand ages and cover types is important for focal species. You know, homogeneous aspen stand's not going to be super valuable and might have higher predation risk than some other stands that have been managed to have a little bit more structure. You know, there's a lot of forest management techniques that can be used, including landscape planning, the silvicultural prescriptions, including tree retention. And all of those, you know, if we think about it with birds in mind, can definitely be implemented to help these guys survive into adulthood. I'm going to transition and really focus on the golden wing warbler at this point. And hopefully you guys all know the golden wing warbler. You've been looking at them too. That's the golden wing warbler. The golden wing warbler is one of the most critically threatened birds in all of North America. It will most likely be listed as a threatened or endangered species in the next decade or so. The populations have been declining rapidly, very, very rapidly. The global population is less than 400,000 individuals, and over 50% and probably even more currently breed in Minnesota. So we are really, really, really important for golden wing warblers. And again, they love young forests. And so what we do in terms of forest management is really important for their long-term population dynamics. In Minnesota, this is from the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas. And we can see in Minnesota, the areas of the darker orange and red is where they're in the highest densities. And so they love the northern third of Minnesota. Of course, in the forested areas, they also love a wet component. So shrubby wetland areas, that's where we're seeing the large majority of them. This map or this graphic is translating, I guess, the trends that have been documented from 1999 to 2019 of the breeding bird surveys throughout the golden wing warblers range. And so I don't know how well you guys can see that, but this is like out east and the Appalachians. And you can see the small red basically means these are areas where the population trends of golden wing warblers have been declining. And the areas of, you know, yellow and blue is where they're increasing, and the bigger the dot, the larger the increase. And so we can see that the species have been decreasing in population basically everywhere except for western Wisconsin, all of Minnesota, and they're actually moving into Canada, Manitoba as well. So the declines seem to be correlated, at least out east, with the loss of young forest and the loss of these mixed sort of forest conditions in some areas of the range. But also one of the big things out east that we're not dealing with quite yet in Minnesota is that they are in competition with a species that they're really closely related to called the blue-winged warbler. And the species hybridizes and it outcompetes it for nesting area. We do have blue-winged warblers in the state, but they're generally in the southern part of the state, but they're creeping their way up. And that'll be a dynamic we'll have to consider for the long-term conservation plans here in Minnesota. But at this point, there's not enough blue-winged warblers to get a ton of data about their competition or hybridization and all that kind of stuff. If we look just in Minnesota, we know that the populations are relatively stable and in some areas actually increasing. So based on our National Forest Breeding Bird Monitoring Program, we know that we've seen pretty steady trends from 1995 to current in both Chippewa and Superior National Forests. So that's awesome because like you can see from the graph, the other graph, they're not stable in most parts of the range. And so it's really great news. And I think it does speak to the good forest management planning and cooperation that we have across agencies here in Minnesota. So for breeding habitat, the golden wing warbler needs a couple of really key components. One is that it needs scattered either individual or groups of trees in overstory, and that's important because the male uses that as a singing perch. So it goes all the way to the top of the tree, even if there's just one in a whole giant stand, it'll get up there and it'll sing that bee buzz buzz song that I played for you before. The female, however, nests in the dense understory. And so, you know, sometimes it's on the ground, but sometimes it's sort of up in like sort of the crux of shrubs or regenerating trees. And those are the two kind of big key components. It does use a variety of forest types for breeding. In Minnesota, we oftentimes see them most in just aspen stands because they're most abundant, but they will use northern hardwood regenerating areas as well. Generally, the best management practices for golden wing warblers say that 10 to 15 residual overstory perch trees per acre are ideal, or 10 to 30% canopy covers, and they have to be relatively large. Trees greater than 9 inches in diameter is generally what they seem to be responding to. A lot of the birds in, especially when they're using a recently harvested stand, will use these transitional zones or sort of these feathered edges along from an open area into a mature forest stand. And so really thinking about that structure again and increasing that, that shrub density is important for just overall breeding habitat. One of the things that we know in Minnesota from both our surveys on the Minnesota National Forest Bird surveys, and then also from the Breeding Bird Atlas that was conducted in 2009 to 2013, is that the birds not only use young forests, but they also really, really love shrubby wetlands. And they also really, really love when shrubby wetlands meet young forests. And so that's when we see the highest density of them. In fact, originally the golden wing warbler was called the swamp warbler because it likes these shrubby wet areas. This is also really important when we think about the blue wing warbler that I mentioned. The blue winged warbler tends to like upland dry habitats, and maybe there'll be less competition as those blue wing warblers sort of come into Minnesota. Maybe there'll be less competition in these shrubby wetland habitats. And so we just really needed to understand the dynamics of the difference of productivity in the shrubby wetlands compared to young forests to see if there's any real differences, if there's differences in habitat characteristics, and if there's, most importantly, any differences in overall nest success and juvenile survival, and how much each of these habitats contribute to overall annual productivity. And hopefully we can figure that out so we can increase the populations across the state instead of them just remaining stable. So again, sort of the focus of this study at this point, it started in, I guess, 2021 and then this year, and then we'll go on for 2 additional years after this, again, funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. What we're trying to assess is, does productivity differ between these two habitats? Does one more likely, if birds are hatched in one of these habitats, are they more likely to become an adult, or are they more likely to die at that nestling or fledgling stage? So for this study, we moved west a bit into the Chippewa National Forest, and our study site is located just south of Elwood, Minnesota. We call it the Hoot and Holler study area because there's a bar there called the Hoot and Holler. And who wouldn't want to say Hoot and Holler is what we figure. But that is the general area. And we focused on young forests, and there's 2 cover types, aspen and northern hardwood study areas. The aspen is basically a traditional, Minnesota Forest Resource Council tree retention guidelines, basically your typical aspen stand. And then the northern hardwood stand had a lot more tree retention, and actually it was mitigated, sort of like they took all of the black ash out of the canopy and left all the other tree species there. And so it was a really unique sort of a cut, but the golden wing warblers seemed to really, really love it. And then we had sort of paired shrubby wetlands next to these upland young forest stands. So the method, similar to the first study, is basically, again, it's Stephen and Brett, the Golden Wing Warbler experts, would go out towards the end of May and map the territories of the singing males. The males generally arrive back on the breeding grounds first. And again, at these study sites, we're walking transects, documenting where the males are singing, seeing how consistent they are. You know, a lot of males will show up and then leave, or some males will show up later. And so doing that for weeks on end to see where actually used territory maps happening. This year, we also used target mist netting to capture and tag both male and female adults. And we're going to try and assess annual survival. So do those adults come back next year? And that's a sort of side project that's in collaboration and run by Amber Roth out of the University of Maine and a whole bunch of other collaborators throughout the country, looking at adult survival to sort of get this big model for assessing golden wing warbler conservation and overall population dynamics. So once we find those territory maps and we know where the males are, then we start looking for the females. And if you find a female, then you can start trying to find the nests, because they also sort of drop down and go to the nest and as they lay their eggs and incubate the eggs as well. This year we used nest cameras to document predation events, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. And then once the birds are old enough, we band the nestlings and fit them with radio transmitters and track them for about 25 days, and then conduct those vegetation surveys to see what the difference is in habitat use, and also then ultimately estimate differences in productivity. So our results, and this is just raw data. Of course, the 2022 data just finalized. And so this is, of course, just raw data. So nothing that I'm going to say necessarily is final, but you can see some of the patterns of what we have observed so far. We've monitored a total of 40 golden wing warbler nests across those 6 sites. And if we compare the young forest sites to the shrubby wetland sites, and we look at nest success, we can see that about 60% of the nests were successful, meaning that they fledged 1 or more young in the young forest, whereas only 30% were successful in the shrubby wetlands. And this is important and why we need long-term studies, especially when we're dealing with small sample sizes like we are with any breeding bird study, is that what happened in a few of our wetland sites this year is that, you guys know, it was really wet in Minnesota and we had a lot of rain during the nesting period, and 6 of the nests in the shrubby wetlands just flooded, and that's what's contributing to the lower nest success rate in those shrubby wetlands. And so again, those 2 extra years of data and adding more sites, we'll be able to see if that continues to be a pattern or if this was just an anomalous year. But overall, the nest predation rate was actually pretty similar. And so that's something that we'll continue to explore as well. But overall nest success was 47%. So 47% of the nests that were initiated fledged 1 or more young. It's not a great number, especially when you're talking about a population you want to increase. We'd love to see it more around the 80%. And we have seen in one of our study sites over 84% nest success. So hopefully, again, as we continue this study, we'll see, we'll build the data and see if it continues to be consistent. Again, to document sort of what is eating this nest predation, which is the major cause of nest failure, we put these cameras as the camera looking at a nest to see what's happening. Before this year, when all the nests flooded, we knew that predation was the major cause of nest failure. And what we wanted to find out is who's eating these birds. And so I'm going to show you some videos that are kind of graphic. So if you're sensitive, maybe look away for a minute or two. So this is, again, footage from the nest cameras. This is a weasel grabbing a fledgling. This is a chipmunk that grabbed an egg. This is, I think, a sad one. This is a garter snake hauling off a fledgling. You could see it had been banded, so it was almost ready to leave the nest. And then this is kind of heartbreaking as well. Both parents are there trying to fend off the snake and get it to leave its babies alone. Of course, unsuccessfully. And then we also have avian predators. We had a lot of mortality this year from broad-winged hawks. You can see it just chewing on that poor little fledgling like it's a piece of chicken. So again, this is data from this year, and so we're just starting to analyze it and look through all the video footage. But it's really amazing technology, and it's cool to see this. I don't think predator types are that are associated with the different nest failures have been documented in golden-winged warblers before. So it's exciting, and stay tuned for more analyses and outcomes from that. The next portion is looking at the juvenile survival. Overall, over the 2 years, we banded 80 fledglings, and then we tagged 56 of them to document survival and track them across the landscape. Again, if we compare the young forest to the shrubby wetland, we have a sort of disproportionate sample sizes because of the big nest failures that we had in the shrubby wetlands. But overall, the juvenile survival is about 40%. So the birds that leave the nest, about only 40% of them survive in the young forest, and 30% of them survive in the shrubby wetland. Overall, from our 4 years, combining the previous study that I mentioned, overall juvenile survival is 40%. If you're doing any sort of math in your head, that is not enough nest success or survival to increase populations. But again, we're hoping that the more data we get, the more we're going to be able to figure this out and see if there's areas where there's higher nest success and juvenile survival compared to others, and try and find some solutions. But it doesn't look great based on this data for the long-term success of golden-winged warblers. This is a golden-winged warbler attempting to leave the nest. The nest is just below the leaves that you're seeing on this screen. But you can you can see the little buddy is not great at flying. He's more of a jumper, right? And essentially he's like a fishing lure, you know, to bass or something. He's just like flopping around there for any predator to come along and grab him. So that's again what we're talking about, that highly vulnerable time. Just as they're old enough to leave the nest, but they're also just haven't learned to fly yet. A lot of the times we'll find just the remnants of these juveniles because they still have the transmitter on. In this case, we found the whole body with the big bite taken out of it. And then in other cases, you see just the leg and the bands. So it's a sad thing. But overall, if we summarize it, 80% of the fledgling mortality occurs approximately 4 days after leaving the nest. So super high vulnerable time. 15% of the mortality occurs for the next about 12 days after leaving the nest. So again, these 2 years of the study have confirmed what we found in the Blandon study that was done in 2019 and 2020, is that they're really dependent on areas with high woody stem density, and those guys that are getting predated tend to be in areas that just don't have as high of woody stem density. And so we can start thinking about, okay, well, we know about what breeding habitat these guys like, but we also want to start thinking about the juvenile habitat. What do they need to get through that really highly vulnerable time? We know that the birds from the tracking data stay within about 100 meters from the nest site in that first 7 days, when again, they're most likely to be eaten. And so we're thinking about like 8 to 10 acres around a nest site. That's what we can call the juvenile habitat sort of space. And if we can get them safe through that time period, they'll survive. They can start moving around. This guy's moving. They'll be dependent on their parents for about another 2 weeks after we get through that time period. But then they start moving to the mid-story and the upper canopy, and they start moving around the forest really quickly and have a much higher chance of making it to adulthood. So, you know, we sort of developed this model of juvenile, not so much even habitat, but juvenile landscapes. And so the model is this, and again, it needs refinement, and we're going to continue to put our data into it. But if we think about a nesting area, generally small space that requires both shrub density and those perch trees for the male, if we think about a 100-meter buffer around that nesting area, that's the area that the birds that are 0 to 7 days are likely to move. So we're thinking about a 10-acre sort of buffer around there that should be really high density shrubs for those juveniles to hide. And then after day 7, they start moving more and more quickly and farther on a daily basis. And so they move up to about 500 meters in that 7 to 14 day time period post-fledge. And that's 190 acres. And so that's a big, big space to think about. But really what they're responding to is having that diverse understory and also a very diverse canopy. And it's not so much as you move from a young forest to an old forest, but they are really looking for areas with structure. You can imagine on this sort of model that if this was all just clear cut, we would have about half as much area available because they couldn't use it, they wouldn't use it, there's not enough dense shrubs for the hiding. And so then we're decreasing the amount of available juvenile habitats on the landscape. So just something to sort of keep in mind, and hopefully we'll formalize that, incorporating into the best management practices in the very near future. As I sort of wrap up, I just wanted to talk about some recommendations for creating high quality habitat for forest birds. And this is congruent and aligns with a lot of the stuff we've been finding with the juvenile habitat work, but also just in general, a lot of best practices that have been published. My PowerPoint is freezing, but I'll just talk while it's thinking about it. Recommendations that have been published about forest birds, including things like the Minnesota Forest Resource Guidelines, recommendations about tree retention. We've found with some of my previous studies that should be a bare minimum, and increasing tree retention does not hinder any young forest species from using those young forests. In fact, it increases the overall species diversity. Thinking about small gaps and different size gaps that mimic natural disturbance is really important for a lot of different forest birds as well. The more structure you have, the more spaces you have for nesting, for hiding, for foraging, all of the things that are really important for maintaining a robust forest bird community. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and try and reboot this for a second. And then I also would like to point out that I had asked Eli to put in the chat a link to resources that have hyperlinks in them to a lot of wonderful resources about forestry for birds, including the recently released Michigan Forestry for Michigan Birds, the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, our story map that we make for the Minnesota National Forest Bird Monitoring Program, all sorts of things. If you want to learn about more birds or get some more forestry tips, you can go ahead and check those out. But
Alexis, I'm going to jump in part to give you a few seconds to try to get your PowerPoint going, if that's going to work. I just realized Tony Miller emailed and said, hey, the chat's not working. What's going on? Sorry about that. That was a setting on my end. It was all on me. I created the Zoom space. I have now enabled chat, so everyone should be able to chat. Someone submitted a question through Q&A, which is great. You can do that too. There we go. Thanks, Tony. So if anyone has tried to use the chat earlier and been unsuccessful, it should work now.
Thanks. I thought nobody was listening. I'll come back to the chat here in just a second. Let me just quickly go through the rest of this since my PowerPoint just rebooted. But again, kind of what I was blathering on about was tree retention, large diameter trees, snags, coarse woody debris, really integrating the any sort of forest harvesting into some of the riparian shrubby wetland. Of course, any sort of lowland or wet forest is all increasing the value for a lot of birds. Over 98% of the birds that breed in Minnesota eat insects. And of course, we know that most insects have some sort of water component. And so, you know, those things sort of add value, I think, to the overall habitat quality, and integrating them and mimicking those natural disturbances that are oftentimes caused by wind or lightning, you know, historically. That increase that structure. I'm sure I'm saying structure a ton. It seems to be just really, really important for these young forest dwelling birds. This is a list of the Forestry for Minnesota bird resources that I asked Eli to link to, that I just mentioned. And hopefully you guys find them very valuable. I will also give a shout out to the Forestry for Minnesota Birds initiative that I'm co-leading with Peter Deeser from the American Bird Conservancy and Mike Lynch from the Forest Stewardship Guild. We're working together with a group of really awesome and interested and passionate people that love to think about how we can improve forestry management practices for birds. And we will be developing forestry specific resources for Minnesota over the next year. And hopefully in the next year or two, we'll have resources in your hand and doing a lot of different workshops to really get some effective on the ground management happening across the landscape. So lastly, I just want to thank all of my funders. The Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund has been awesome. Nikasi, also such a long-term and great supporter of all of our work. The American Bird Conservancy, especially Peter Deeser, is awesome. Chippewa Superior National Forest have been long-term supporters, and UPM Blandon have been helping us for a very long time as well. So I want to also say thank you to all the wonderful field techs that actually collect this data day in and day out all summer long, and have sacrificed a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, part of their soul probably, to learn more about birds and to make our conservation plans more effective and impactful. So with that, then I will stop sharing and answer any questions.
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A from Casey. Do you think with an increase in wet conditions, it will be a problem for future nest success for birds breeding in shrubby wetlands?
Yeah, that's what we are hoping to find out. I'll say the 2 years, so 20, it couldn't have been more different. So the 2 years we've been focusing on shrubby wetland, 2021, you remember, is a tremendous drought year, and there was basically no insects out there at all, and there was great nest success in the shrubby wetlands. And then 2022 was very, very wet, and so you know, I think we'll see that with climate change, of course, those big extremes. The flooding event that sort of wiped out a lot of the shrubby wetland nests this year was a really big rainfall, and then like a lot of the vegetation that the nests were on were just kind of like became uprooted and like tipped over. So I don't know how consistent those conditions will be as we start looking at more shrubby wetland sites across the landscape, but it's something that we'll hopefully find out. I will say that my hypothesis was that productivity and survival will be higher in shrubby wetlands, and I was wrong at this point. But you know, I just thought there's less competition and more insects and maybe less predators willing to tromp through the swamps, and we just see them in such high densities that I thought shrubby wetlands would be better than they are based on our data, but we'll see if that bears truth over time.
And another question from Tony: does forest management for the birds also benefit the predator populations, and are you looking into that as well?
We are, yes. So Brett Howland, my master's student, also conducted systematic predator surveys to see where the predators were, what we could document, you know, what habitat features we were seeing basically the highest predator densities. And the question is a great question that we hope to have an answer to. But I mean, you could certainly think there are definitely some features that are good for birds that are good for predators as well. And so what's that threshold, or what creates a high predator density area? You know, oftentimes we think about high edge areas with high edge where predators sort of will prowl around. And so we're seeing if that holds true both with those specific sort of small scale habitat features and across the landscape. So that's a great question that we're looking into, and hopefully we'll be analyzing that data this year.
Another question: red shoulder hawk habitat is a consideration that comes up for many of our timber sales, with large mature forest landscaping important for these birds and other birds that use mature interior forests. And it seems like these species habitat needs contradict each other? Is there landscape habitat management that can balance both habitats?
Yeah, so that's exactly what the idea of Forestry for Minnesota Birds is because definitely, you know, I know we talk a lot about golden wing warblers here in Minnesota, but it's not the only bird species, right? And they have habitat needs that are very different than a lot of other species. And so figuring out what that balance on the landscape is and sort of focusing on where are the birds, where do they have high breeding density areas, compared to like what kind of forest cover types are there and what kind of management practices might take place. You know, those are all things that aren't just it's not a black and white answer. There's a lot of nuance to it, and sort of having a guide that can say, okay, well, if you're in this part of the state, these birds are probably the most important, and these are the cover types that are most abundant. Let's do this. Or, you know, compared to like on the North Shore, there's very different considerations. So that's exactly why we're trying to develop these Minnesota specific guidelines, because you're right, it's not easy and they can be contradictory, but also, you know, prioritizing one species over the other across the board isn't always a great idea either. We do a lot of studies that aren't young forest dependent species. And of course, those are very different results and different needs than the golden wing warbler stuff that I've been talking about today.
Then could you define the size range for small gaps?
Yeah, anywhere from, you know, 1/10 of an acre. A lot of the ones that we look at or see, especially in our northern hardwood sites, are, you know, about a 1/2 acre gap. And I mean, I would say any sort of size class that really where you can get those little pockets of regeneration and add shrub density could be valuable. We've seen we're doing a longer term study in Aiken County where they're looking at of group or gap selection to regenerate northern hardwoods, and the golden wings have been coming into those 0.5 acre gaps. We haven't done the productivity assessment yet, but the males are certainly there, and I think that was a surprise to us because we think they need big tracts of early successional, but if the other parts of the habitat are there, maybe maybe that could be successful. But in terms of just forest birds in general, a range of gap sizes tend to be beneficial no matter what.
And have you noticed that technicians are attracting predators to nest due to the monitoring activities?
Also a great question. Also a great question. We oftentimes feel like we make trails and lead raccoons or whatever right up to the predators, and so we did have some dummy nests to assess that. And just based on the raw data, it didn't seem like the nests that we went to and didn't go to regularly didn't have that big of a deal. But also that's why we were using the cameras, is because then we don't have to go there and monitor like every other day or whatever, and we can minimize the disturbance. And so so there doesn't seem to be an effect, but also, like, of course there might be. And so when we're talking about golden wing warblers, we want to do anything we can to mitigate it. But the cameras, I mean, were just such an awesome technology that we used this year that helped us decrease the disturbance to the nesting pairs.
Then I have a question relating to woodcock in particular, because you mentioned the messy forestry. Has there been any work kind of connecting different levels of slash distribution or retention relating to the habitat for that messy forest floor?
I don't think there has been any. At our study site, it was just sort of happened to be two contrasted areas right next to each other, and they definitely used the messy prescription or forest or whatever more often. But it would be great to continue to look into it. Again, woodcock are tricky to study without a dog, and so you know, if anybody has a dog and wants to train it, and we could have a whole team of them out there looking at more nests, so we could do that in a systematic way, it would be really awesome.
Another question in chat here. Would you ever consider European buckthorn to be dense brush cover that could be suitable habitat? Please say no.
Please say no. No, no, that is not great at all. That has, yeah, no.
And Eli's posted a lot of different comments here in chat relating to our future offerings, both next September's webinar series, as well as a variety of workshops. So September is going to be and October are going to be some busy months for SFEC, as well as he's also posted the link for getting credit. That's the Z link, the Web CE 22. So be sure to fill that out. And we've got a few more minutes if folks have any more questions here. Otherwise, we can give you all the rest of your morning. Another question in chat from Casey. What type of cameras did you use?
Oh, that's a good question. They were Browning and they were special, so they didn't have like the light to attract predators or detract from or like do anything to harm the birds. If you want to email me, I can get you the model. It's agrinde@d.umn.edu, but I don't remember it off the top of my head. Sorry.
And just pasted the email in chat. And then another question, what other species of birds fill this niche further to the west and southwest? I'm assuming that's the west and southwest of Minnesota.
Well, shrubby wetlands. Well, if we're talking about Minnesota, I guess the west and southwest, you know, we kind of get out of the more forested areas and more into the prairie and conservation. So the bird communities really shift. And so but you know, species that use similar habitats are things like common yellowthroat, yellow warblers, chestnut-sided warblers, Nashville warblers even use a lot of the little similar habitats, and they're more widely distributed than golden wings.
Unmute here. Can you give us a brief preview of ideal habitat for each of the nests and fledglings of the 3 species? Maybe you can call up the slide again with that breakdown.
Sure. Let me hope that I'm gonna switch or go back to my PowerPoint here. And hope that it doesn't freeze. Eli, or Elaine, do you guys make these slides available? Would that be useful to you?
We could have a link to it. Otherwise, with this being recorded, folks will be able to, when you went over the slides, they'll be able to pause and linger as much as they want on the slides. Because that's a good reminder, actually. Thank you. We will be recording this and posting it on the event page for August, so folks can view and share it in the future.
Okay.
But yeah, if you want to pass the slides on, I could.
I will do that. And Thomas, if you want to email me, I can do it. All the videos make my PowerPoint sort of glitchy right now. But I can show you the different outcomes of that for sure.
Any last questions before we bring this to an end? Not seeing any pop up. Will you present final results at the Minnesota Wildlife Conference?
You bet. Yeah. We usually have a contingent there, and so I know Brett is hoping to graduate in the spring, and so hopefully he'll have his results finalized by the wildlife conference time period, and at least some of them will be formalized. But yeah, I definitely hope that you guys will be sick of me by when we get all the final results, everything published.
Then another question, does it pay to provide habitat for golden wing warblers on the edge of their range?
Yes. You know, that's a really important question to think about too. Golden wing warblers are really climate sensitive or vulnerable to climate change, as indicated by a lot of different studies. Specifically, there's a really cool results on Audubon's website, but yeah, at the edge of the range, you know, as they're sort of transitioning up, I mean, I think for a species like golden wing, just thinking about all the habitat across the range, we're not seeing a huge like a movement like we are with some of like the lowland conifer species, Connecticut warbler, boreal chickadee. We're definitely seeing a transition there. We're not seeing that quite yet in Minnesota for golden wings. So I think at this point, definitely providing as much habitat as it can, even if it is at the southern edge of the range, is still beneficial.
And with that, I think we're going to call it there. Thank you to all the attendees. This is a really great, engaging chat. We appreciate you all asking all your questions. and interacting. And just want to thank Alexis for delivering a really great presentation.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you all and have a great rest of your day.